Hi everyone. So this is section 6 of chapter 17, and what we're going to be taking a look at is how do those cells respond once the hormones have actually interacted with the cell. So that was our last section, or the last video that you looked at, hopefully, was going to be the interaction, the actual interaction. How do the hormones go in and communicate with the cells? Now we just have to take a look at the different factors of how those cells are going to respond to the interaction. We're going to be taking a look at how the number of receptors are definitely going to cause different effects. We're going to also take a look at what happens when you do have more than 2, 3 hormones actually interacting with the cell at the same time. So let's take a look at this. So this is showing just 3 different cells, and look, they have different receptors, right? You have this adipose cell that can bind a couple of different hormones. This liver cell can go in and bind a couple or 3 different hormones. Look, it can bind 2 of the same ones that the adipose cell can actually go in and bind, can interact with as well. And then you have the muscle cell here. It has different ones too. So different target cells can have different receptors, and what it does is it's just going to allow them to bind different hormones, and depending on the hormone, it's going to, of course, affect them in different ways. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at, is if we do have this hormone going in and interacting with the receptor. Remember, these are all those all of the receptors that are actually on the outside of the cell, embedded in the plasma membrane. So we have water-soluble hormones right here binding, but remember, you do have those intracellular receptors that the lipid-soluble hormones are interacting with as well. So we just have to keep that in mind, that even though this is the only picture they ever show us of receptors, there are the ones on the inside as well. So let's take a look first at how the amount of hormones that are floating around in the blood are going to actually go in and cause the number of receptors that we have to fluctuate. So let's take a look at the upregulation first. Upregulation means that there's not a whole lot of hormones in the blood. So what the cell is going to do is it's going to go in and make more receptors in the plasma membrane. And what that does is it's just going to increase the probability that the hormone is going to be able to interact with the receptor in the first place. So backing up a little bit, remember that the plasma membrane is very dynamic. It changes all the time. So it can go in and build up a new receptor, or it can break down a receptor if it needs to. So that's what's really fascinating about the cell membrane, and how it can be so different from one minute to the next. So that's upregulation. It's going to be responsible, or it's going to happen whenever we have a lower number of hormone concentration. So I like to, I guess, kind of give the analogy for upregulation. Let's take a look and see what happens if you had, so here's a field goal. I don't know if you guys knew, this is a field goal, and this is in the end zone, right? It's usually right smack dab in the middle of the end zone. In order to increase your probability of actually making a field goal, I bet if you put a bunch more, probably using that term wrong, right? Field goal, or whatever these are called right here. Sorry, football fans. That's horrible, isn't it? But anyway, so I digress. But if your probability to actually be able to make one of these is going to be a lot higher if you have more of those goal posts down there at the end of the end zone, right? So that's kind of how upregulation is going to work, is you're increasing the probability of having a hormone attach and bind to one of those receptors in times of low hormone concentration. So let's go in and erase my beautiful football analogy. All right, so let's take a look at down regulation. Let's take a look and see what happens when you have an overabundance of hormones that are in the blood at that point. So you don't want that cell to be overstimulated. So if you don't want that cell overstimulated, you better take away some of those receptors. And that's exactly what happens with down regulation. It's going in, decreasing the number of receptors in that plasma membrane or on the inside, and that's going to help decrease hormone sensitivity. So you do this to make sure that you're doing it to prevent overstimulation or understimulation of that cell. Sometimes this can occur not only because of concentration, but sometimes just through development, cell cycle, cell activity. Like if a cell becomes more mature, then it can also change how it responds to a receptor, how many receptors it has as well. So now let's take a look at what happens whenever, so if we take a look, let's go back again over here and we take a look at how we have some cells that have 3 or more receptors, and that means that it can 3 or more hormones can go in and bind to it. Let's take a look and see what happens whenever that's the case. So there's 3 different types of interactions that occur whenever hormones interact with a cell. You can have something called a synergistic interaction, and that's going to be where one activity is going in and reinforcing the activity of another hormone, and it's giving a much greater response. You also have one called permissive interactions, and that's going to be where you have one hormone kind of giving permission for the second hormone to do something. Actually, usually the first hormone is required if the second hormone wants to be able to do anything with that cell. And then you can have antagonistic interactions where you have one hormone that's going in and opposing the effects of another hormone. So let's talk about some examples of these so it can be a little bit better of what we're talking about here, or so we can kind of understand what I am talking about here if I can get my words out. Let's start with antagonistic, because I think it's always one that's a little bit easier to understand. Two of the best examples, 2 hormones that is the best example of antagonistic hormone is going to be insulin and glucagon. If you have insulin binding and if you have glucagon binding, then they actually oppose the effects that are happening on that cell. Because remember, one is going to help lower blood glucose levels, and then you have the other one that's going to go in and help increase blood glucose levels. So usually it doesn't happen because of when they're secreted, but that's a good example of antagonistic, the hormones that are going to be antagonistic. Let's talk about the permissive example. This is going to be where you have this first hormone that needs to work in order for the second one to work. So a really good example is prolactin and oxytocin. Prolactin is responsible for milk production. Oxytocin is responsible for milk ejection. Well, you can't eject milk if you don't produce any milk, right? So that's a good example of permissive, where you have to have that first one to be able to allow that second one to even do its job. Another good one is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is actually responsible for the development of reproductive hormones and things like that. So that's another good one where you have to have thyroid hormones that are going in to allow other hormones to even do their job. Synergistic is going to be where you have 2 hormones that are going in that are producing the same effect, but because you have 2 of them, it's a greater effect than you would have if you only had one. Estrogen and progesterone are good examples of that one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So this is just a nice little picture of the summary that we just went through. We went through all of the different glands that secreted the different hormones, and then from there we talked about the different types of hormones we had, lipid soluble versus water soluble, and how that actually affected their transport in the bloodstream. And that also, of course, affected how they responded once they got to, or not responded, how they interacted with the cell once they got there. And then we talked about the different types of cellular responses after that. So from here on out, we're really just going to go through and take a look at these different glands, and we're going to talk about the different hormones that each of them produce and their effects. So until next time.